It is late 1943, somewhere over the Ruhr, and a Lancaster bomber is coming apart in the night sky. The flight engineer has perhaps 90 seconds to decide what he takes with him before he jumps. He cannot carry a rucksack. He cannot carry a torch or spare boots or a proper atlas. What he can carry, folded into a square smaller than a cigarette packet and tucked into the lining of his battledress, is a map printed on silk. It does not rustle when the wind catches his parachute. It will not disintegrate if he lands in a ditch or a river or the sodden fields of the Rhineland in November. It shows him, in astonishing and unforgiving detail, exactly how far he is from neutral territory, and exactly which roads, rivers, and railway lines lie between him and safety. He has never used it before. He may never need it again. But if he does, it may be the only thing standing between him and a prison camp, or worse. Tens of thousands of Allied airmen went into occupied Europe carrying one of these maps, and most of them never gave a second thought to who had made it possible or how strange the story behind it truly was. This is not, on its face, a story about weapons or aircraft or code-breaking machines. It is a story about paper, ink, and silk, and about one deeply unconventional man who convinced the British War Office that a map, properly made and properly hidden, could be as valuable as a rifle. By the end of the war, over 400,000 of these maps had been printed, and it is estimated that close to half of the 35,000 Allied servicemen who escaped or evaded capture in Europe did so with one of them in their pocket. That is not a footnote. That is a machine for saving lives, built almost entirely from ingenuity, obstinacy, and cloth. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what a captured or shot-down serviceman actually had to work with before anyone thought to give him a map at all. In the opening years of the war, an airman who bailed out over Germany or occupied France carried almost nothing designed for the ordeal ahead. Standard-issue paper maps, where they existed, were bulky, easily torn, and hopeless in wet weather. A soaked map dissolved into pulp within hours, and a folded paper map made a distinct, betraying noise in the dark. Worse, ordinary maps of enemy territory were themselves treated as sensitive documents, difficult to source in the quantities needed, and almost impossible to distribute covertly to men who might be captured at any moment. An escaping prisoner without local knowledge, without language, and without a reliable sense of direction stood very little chance of reaching neutral ground on foot across hundreds of miles of hostile country. Records from the First World War suggested that escape was possible, but only barely, and only for a small, resourceful minority. There was also the matter of language and local knowledge, which conventional training simply could not supply. A British or American airman parachuting into rural France, Belgium, or the Low Countries typically spoke no French, Flemish, or Dutch beyond a handful of phonetically memorized phrases, and had no way of judging which villagers might help him and which might, out of fear or genuine sympathy for the occupier, report him within the hour. A map alone could not solve that problem, but it could at least remove one enormous source of uncertainty, telling a man which direction held the shortest route to a river crossing, a demarcation line, or a stretch of coast from which a small boat might realistically reach England. Without that, an escaper was reduced to guessing based on the position of the sun and whatever scraps of geography he could recall from a peacetime atlas. Hardly the basis for a journey that might stretch across several countries and many weeks. The problem was compounded by geography and by the sheer scale of the air war. As RAF and later American bomber crews flew ever deeper into Germany, the distances between a crash site and neutral Switzerland, Sweden, or Spain grew accordingly, sometimes exceeding 600 or 700 kilometers of unfamiliar, heavily patrolled terrain. A downed airman had to cross rivers, railway lines, and checkpoints, often at night, frequently without so much as a compass, and with only the vaguest sense of where the front lines or safe corridors actually lay. Military planners understood, at least in theory, that a well-prepared escaper was far more valuable than a demoralized prisoner sitting out the war behind wire, A trained pilot or navigator who escaped back to Britain could fly again, while every guard, dog, and hour spent recapturing him drained enemy resources. But knowing this and acting on it were different things. What was needed was some way to put detailed, accurate, up-to-date maps into the hands of servicemen before capture, and to smuggle further supplies to those already in captivity, all without alerting the enemy that such a system existed at all. Ordinary paper simply could not do the job, and by 1939, nobody in British intelligence had solved the problem of what might. The task fell, almost by accident, to a branch of military intelligence called MI9, formed at the end of 1939 under an officer named Norman Crockett to handle escape and evasion for Allied servicemen. Crockett needed people who could think sideways, and one of the men he recruited was Christopher Clayton Hutton, a journalist, former First World War pilot, and self-described enthusiast of stage escapology, who reportedly secured his interview largely on the strength of a story about once challenging Harry Houdini. Hutton, known to colleagues as Clutty, was by most accounts a difficult, unorthodox man who clashed constantly with military bureaucracy, and who was, by his own account, deliberately kept away from the main MI9 offices so that his more irregular methods of acquiring materials would not embarrass anyone too directly. Whatever the truth of the office politics, Hutton's brief was straightforward and enormous. Design, source, and distribute the tools an escaping servicemen would actually need, and find a way to get them behind enemy lines undetected. Hutton decided early that a map was the single most important item any escaper could carry, and set about solving the material problem that had defeated everyone before him. Paper was fragile and noisy. What he wanted was something thin enough to vanish into a seam or a heel, tough enough to survive weeks in a boot or a mud-soaked pocket, and quiet enough not to betray a man crouched in a hedgerow at night. Silk suggested itself almost immediately, but early attempts to print detailed cartography onto silk squares failed badly, the fine lines and place names blurring into illegible smudges the moment ink met fiber. The breakthrough came when Hutton's team began adding pectin, the same substance used to set jam, to the printing ink, which stopped it from spreading across the weave and allowed genuinely fine detail to survive the printing process. With a workable method in hand, Hutton turned to established manufacturers, including the cartographic firm run by John Bartholomew in Edinburgh for the source maps themselves, and to printing houses such as John Waddington Limited, better known at the time for board games, to handle production at scale. The maps that emerged from this partnership were remarkable objects. Many were printed double-sided, doubling their usefulness without adding appreciably to their bulk, and folded so tightly that a map covering a substantial stretch of occupied Europe could be tucked inside a boot heel, a cigarette case, or the lining of a flying jacket without any noticeable change in shape or weight. Because silk itself became difficult to source in wartime quantities, MI9 also experimented with rayon and other synthetic fibers, and, through a naval intelligence contact, discovered a supply of Japanese mulberry leaf paper with the texture of onion skin, which could be soaked, balled up, and flattened out again without tearing or losing its printed detail. To put the scale of this operation in perspective, printing 400,000 maps to this standard, each one a small feat of textile engineering rather than an ordinary print run, would have strained even a well-established commercial press. Achieving it in wartime conditions, with paper and dye shortages affecting almost every other branch of British industry, says something about the priority Crockett's section was eventually given, however grudgingly, once its early results began to filter back. Later escape kits paired these maps with the other tools Hutton's section developed in parallel. Tiny compasses concealed inside uniform buttons or tunic collars, and small steel saws hidden in pencils or shaving brushes, so that an evading airman carried, in effect, a complete miniature survival kit distributed across a dozen unremarkable-looking objects. Getting these materials into the hands of men who had not yet been captured was one challenge, Getting them to men already sitting in prison camps behind German wire was another entirely, and arguably, the more audacious of the two. Hutton's section built an elaborate system of fictitious relief organizations, complete with invented letterheads and charitable-sounding names, which sent parcels to named prisoners through what appeared to be entirely ordinary channels. Camps generally permitted prisoners to receive parcels from private well-wishers and charitable bodies, and the Geneva Conventions of the era gave the Red Cross and genuine relief organizations relatively free passage, a legitimacy that MI9's fictional donors could quietly ride on. Early parcels contained only genuine, unaltered goods, allowing the section to establish which routes and camps reliably delivered post, and only once a channel had proven itself would altered items, games, gramophone records, chess sets, playing cards, each modified to conceal a map, a compass, a file, or forged identity papers, begin to move along it. It is thought to have taken roughly 3 months on average to establish a workable channel into a given camp before contraband could safely follow. If you're finding this as strange and fascinating as I do, a quick subscribe helps this channel more than you might think. Perhaps the most celebrated single vehicle for this smuggling operation was the humble board game Monopoly, produced under license in Britain by John Waddington Limited, the same firm printing many of MI9's Silk maps. The game's large folding board offered exactly the kind of concealed space Hutton needed, and it is documented that certain modified Monopoly sets, distinguishable to MI9's own people by a small marking on the board, were dispatched to specific camps carrying a silk map appropriate to that region tucked beneath the printed board surface, alongside a working compass, and, in some versions, genuine currency hidden among the game's play money. The full scope of the Monopoly operation remained classified for decades after the war, only becoming public knowledge when relevant British files were declassified in the mid-1980s, and the equivalent American program, run by MIS-X, was not confirmed until several years later still, when a surviving participant was given clearance to speak. No modified boards are known to have survived. Prisoners were instructed to destroy them once their contents had been used, and MI9 destroyed remaining stock at the war's end, which is part of why so much of this story rests on later testimony and declassified paperwork rather than surviving physical evidence. What can be said with more confidence is that these maps saw genuine use across a wide range of documented escapes. Airmen shot down over occupied France frequently relied on silk maps to navigate towards resistance-held safe houses and onward along established escape lines towards Spain, while prisoners held further east in camps such as Stalag Luft III, the site of the escape later dramatized as the Great Escape, are known to have used concealed maps and compasses among the wider array of tools smuggled in by MI9 and produced within the camps themselves. One American officer held at that same camp is recorded as having attempted a solo escape in late 1943, armed with equipment traceable to Hutton's section, a reminder that the maps were not confined to any single nationality or camp once the American authorities had adopted the British system for their own aircrew. Precise, verifiable figures for how many individual escapes depended specifically on a silk map, as opposed to local guidance, luck, or other equipment, are difficult to establish, since so much of the operational detail was destroyed or never formally recorded at the time. Historians researching the subject generally rely on Hutton's own post-war account, held-back official files, and the testimony of surviving escapers, and the resulting picture, while broadly consistent, inevitably contains gaps that cannot now be filled with certainty. It is worth setting the British program against what the Germans and the Americans were doing with maps of their own, because the contrast is instructive. German forces produced conventional paper maps of excellent cartographic quality for their own troops, but there is little evidence of any comparable large-scale program dedicated to helping captured German personnel escape Allied custody. Escape from Allied POW camps was a far rarer proposition in any case, given the relative geography and the lower incentive to invest scarce wartime resources in such a scheme. The Americans, by contrast, adopted the British approach directly and enthusiastically once MI9 shared its methods, including the illustrated internal catalog Per Ardua Libertas, with a visiting delegation of American intelligence officers in 1942. Following that meeting, the United States began producing its own escape and evasion maps in significant numbers through the Army Map Service, generally printed on rayon acetate rather than true silk, though they continued to be referred to informally by the silkier name out of habit. In practical terms, British and American programs ended up complementing one another, sharing source cartography and production know-how. And it is fair to say the American effort would have taken considerably longer to establish without Hutton's earlier groundwork. Assessing the true impact of this program means holding two things in mind at once: the psychological and the material. Materially, the escape rate among Allied airmen who evaded capture altogether, rather than escaping after being taken prisoner, appears to have been meaningfully improved by the availability of reliable route information, though isolating the map's contribution from other factors, weather, terrain, local sympathies, sheer luck, is not something the surviving records allow historians to do with precision. Psychologically, the effect may have been just as significant. Aircrew who knew they carried a genuine chance of finding their way home, rather than facing certain capture the moment they hit the ground, are widely reported to have approached operations over enemy territory with somewhat greater confidence, and training in escape and evasion technique, backed by tangible equipment rather than mere instruction, appears to have been treated by Bomber Command and its American counterparts as a meaningful contributor to aircrew morale. The map, in other words, did work whether or not it was ever actually used, simply by existing in a man's pocket as evidence that someone, somewhere, had planned for his survival. The legacy of Hutton's work outlasted the war by decades. The British and American militaries continued producing evasion charts on ever more durable materials, moving from silk and rayon through vinyl in the post-war decades to modern synthetic Tyvek-style sheets still issued to aircrew today, a lineage that runs in an unbroken technical line back to the pectin and silk experiments of 1940. That lineage was tested again and again in later conflicts. American aircrew flying over Korea and later Vietnam carried direct descendants of Hutton's maps, and at least one prolonged evasion in the skies over Vietnam is credited, in later official accounts, with informing the design of subsequent generations of evasion charts. A reminder that the underlying problem Hutton set out to solve, how to give a stranded serviceman a reliable, concealable sense of where he is, never really went away, only the materials changed. Hutton himself struggled financially after the war and spent years fighting to publish his own account of the work, eventually released as official secret, only to find the authorities of the day still deeply uneasy about a former intelligence officer revealing methods that, in their view, might yet prove useful again. Surviving examples of the maps themselves, along with some of the concealment devices Hutton's section produced, can today be seen in collections including the Imperial War Museum in London, quiet, unassuming squares of printed silk that give very little sense, at a glance, of how many lives once depended on them. Return, for a moment, to that flight engineer over the Ruhr, falling through the dark with a folded silk square tucked against his chest. He does not know Christopher Clayton Hutton's name. He has never heard of Norman Crockett or Waddington's, or the fictitious charities that smuggled contraband past camp sensors for years without detection. He knows only that the small, silent, waterproof object in his pocket might, if the worst happens, be the difference between reaching Switzerland and spending the rest of the war behind wire. That is the entire point of the story. The map worked precisely because it asked to be noticed by no one. Not the enemy searching a captured airman, not the guard inspecting a parcel of board games, not even, in many cases, historians decades later trying to reconstruct exactly how many lives it saved. It was built to disappear into the ordinary, and in doing so, it carried tens of thousands of men a little closer to home. 400,000 maps printed in near-total secrecy, hidden in boot heels and record sleeves and the folding boards of a children's game, and not one of them designed to be remembered. That perhaps is the truest measure of how well they worked.